Hello everyone! Got another Midwestern Marx reaction video here. I said we were going to react to Steven Crowder reacting to the School of Life Karl Marx video that I talked about in the last video. And today I have a very special guest, TikTok extraordinaire, future President Matt Connolly.
How's it going, everybody?
Yes. You excited to talk about this, Matt? You've watched the video.
Yeah.
I have not.
It's really bad. Basically, Steven Crowder thinks that communism is when the government does stuff. So I'm really excited to break this video down and see where he gets stuff wrong.
Yes, should be hilarious. So let's go. We're going to play the first 5 seconds of this video before Steven Crowder says a slur.
Stop conflating communism and democratic socialism because it's unfair and inaccurate, said the person who supportively sent me this Karl Marx video on YouTube. Rebuttal time, you bearded fat.
So apparently somebody sent this video to Steven Crowder, this Karl Marx video, to prove that democratic socialism is different from socialism and communism, which I don't really understand. But of course, Crowder's immediate response is to use a homophobic slur. So what a guy.
I also think it's funny that Crowder argues from the perspective of capitalism here because he really truly believes that capitalism is a meritocracy. Well, he got his start when his dad gave him a bunch of money to start Louder with Crowder, showing that capitalism is not as much of a meritocratic system as he truly believes it is.
That's pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Exactly, using daddy's money to enrich yourself.
Yep.
This one's by popular request because this Karl Marx video is a little old but has enjoyed a second win specifically due to the Bernie Sanders supporters, as you will see in the comments section, despite the fact that they swear up and down socialism and communism have nothing to do with each other.
Man, okay, what a way to start off. So, I'll admit that during the Bernie campaign, and we were Bernie guys, we knocked doors for Bernie and whatnot, but the public's view of socialism was a little distorted because Bernie's essentially a social democrat, right, which is when the government puts checks on capitalism. And people were arguing that that is socialism. But right now we're talking about Karl Marx and Karl Marx's philosophy. And to Marx, socialism was nothing but a lower stage of communism. Socialism is when the classes are abolished and the state can begin to wither away into communism. And yeah.
I think it's also funny. So throughout this video, pay attention to Steven Crowder's understanding of communism. He truly believes that it's like the Richard Wolff meme, where socialism is when the government does stuff. And the more stuff it does, the more socialist the country is. And the more stuff the government does, if it does a lot of stuff, that's communism.
If it does a real lot of stuff, that's communism. Steven Crowder.
Oh, yeah.
Let's get to it.
Most people agree that we need to improve our economic system somehow. Yet we're also often keen to dismiss the ideas of capitalism's most famous and ambitious critic, Karl Marx.
Straw man! Nobody dismisses him. Everybody who's read Karl Marx and understands economics doesn't like him. They're not dismissing him, they're listening to him saying, oh, you're an insane person, and deciding to go the other direction.
Yes, every intelligent person who's ever read Karl Marx dismissed him. There have not been millions of genius thinkers who have called themselves Marxists and have used Marx's method and Marx's thought to produce new analyses and new ideas. There's definitely not a branch of Marxist ecology that looks at different ways of controlling the economy, using central planning to create an economy that is sustainable with the environment in times of climate crisis. That doesn't exist. All economists who read Karl Marx immediately punted it out of the window and said, no, I'm going back to read Mises. Just kidding. The only reason that libertarians and ANCAPs, these folks like Steven Crowder, are able to say this, like all economists have debunked Karl Marx, is because of the millions and millions of dollars that have been dumped into the most prestigious universities, particularly the Chicago School. But all the most prestigious universities and Ivy League universities get Koch money and right-wing think tank money to put right-wing professors in. That doesn't mean they don't have Marxist professors and left-wing professors, but economics programs in the West are largely dominated by what Marx would call bourgeois economics, which don't criticize the system, but rather just analyze how the system functions, and they teach young economists how to keep the system going and how to privatize everything and hand everything away to the rich. And that's the kind of economics that's the most prominent in the West. But not around the rest of the world. And of course, there are millions of genius Marxist thinkers who have used Marx's works to analyze the world around us. You got anything to add, Matt?
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of when some people have come to the conclusion that Marx is correct from their own personal experiences. So specifically, I'm talking about Parenti. I love the quote where he says that, whenever anybody would come up to him and say, well, that's Marx, what you're describing right now is Marx, you'd go, oh, this Marx guy is onto something. Same with Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff, if you've ever looked into any of his personal history, he said that he was never really a Marxist until he just kind of came to the conclusions himself in college that, this system is kind of broken. It's skewed against workers and towards the interest of capital. And so the idea that anybody can look at Marx and just, throw him out the window is not true from the fact that people, come there from their own personal experiences, but also, like Eddie said, it's just the
method.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, it's like Che Guevara said, it's not my fault reality is Marxist. And the way I got into it was, I studied geopolitics for 3 years and I was a social democrat. And then I read Marx and Lenin's analysis of imperialism. I'm like, oh, all the wars make sense. The wars are for capitalist expansion. And these guys who understood how the system worked, told us that these were going to happen as long as we allowed capitalism to continue. So yeah, the idea that Marx's analyses are useless is very silly, very Western-centric idea that you would expect from a loudmouth like Steven Crowder.
This isn't very surprising. In practice, his political and economic ideas have been used to design disastrously planned economies and nasty dictatorships. Nevertheless, we shouldn't reject Marx too quickly. We ought to see him as a guide whose diagnosis of capitalism's ills helps us to navigate towards a more promising future. Capitalism is going to have to be reformed, and Marx's analyses are going to be part of any answer.
Before we get to some details here, it's really important. This person is trying to present this as unbiased, but they're telling you that you ought to and should look to Karl Marx as a guide. They also say it has maybe been used for some bad regimes. Okay, let's flip that. Name me any good communist economies that have come. One. Let's start with one.
So I mentioned this earlier, but Steven Crowder obviously doesn't have any understanding of Marxism or communism. He often conflates socialism and communism, and he also thinks that, like I said, communism is when the government does stuff. I also wanted to point out that despite what Steven Crowder and a lot of right-wing pundits will say, communism has never actually been tried in the world. There's never been a stateless, classless, moneyless society. And so to say that, communism, look at this, there's failures of communism is, just not true.
I mean, we've seen communist countries, communist governments who establish dictatorship of the proletariat, and use central planning to do what most people describe as state capitalism. And obviously, communism is this idea of a stateless, classless society. And I mean, the idea of abolishing borders, like, we're far from that, right? Socialism is something that needs to be built. But in the process of building socialism, countries like Russia and China turned themselves into superpowers using central planning. Countries like Cuba, Vietnam, and Venezuela abolished illiteracy and built new universities and raised people out of poverty. Bolivia is probably one of the most successful socialist countries functioning in the world today. And there's a study that proved this. I mean, this was from a while ago. It was a 1986 study by Dr. Howard Waitskin that compared the quality of life in socialist countries versus capitalist countries. And in socialist countries, they were better. And like I said, this shouldn't come as a surprise. Pre-revolutionary Russia was a feudal third world society run by a corrupt monarchy. And China was brutally exploited by capitalist imperialism from Europe. So, yeah, they definitely improved the quality of life, even though it wasn't full communism or socialism.
Marx was born in 1818 in Trier in Germany. Soon he became involved with the Communist Party, a tiny group of intellectuals advocating for the overthrow of the class system and the abolition of private property.
First up, how does anyone watch this, hear that, and not literally soil themselves? Abolition of private property. The thing you're watching this on, it's not yours. Belongs to this bearded guy.
So Eddie and I have addressed this topic before, but there's a difference between personal property and private property. No communist wants to take your laptop and seize that for the good of the state. When we're talking about private property, we're talking about property that's used in the generation of profits, usually at the expense in the exploitation of the workers. So nobody's coming to take your toothbrush, your laptop, or whatever. This idea that oh yeah, private property will be abolished, therefore you won't have any material possessions, is just absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I mean, your toothbrush will not belong to the government, basically. People are talking about nationalization of industry, right? We're not saying we should seize everyone's television. We're saying we should seize the Koch brothers' oil rigs that they set up in Iraq after destroying the country. So, yeah. So let's go.
He worked as a journalist and had to flee Germany, eventually settling in London. Marx wrote an enormous number of books and articles, sometimes with his friend Friedrich Engels.
Also a prick.
Modern work is alienated. Think of the person who built this chair. It's straightforward, strong, honest, and elegant. It's an example of how, at its best, labour offers us a chance to externalise what's good inside us.
So right off the bat, let's break this down, using their example. Simple one, a chair. It was made by workers. That feels good. You made a chair. But what does it not account for? Innovation, creativity, risk, advancement, progress. This is why, and I'll prove this as a recurring theme, outside of some weapons created by government, no communist regimes or countries have been at the forefront of giant leaps in technology or innovation. Those gifts have never been given to the world through communism.
Through and just break down everything that Steven Crowder here says you need you need capitalism for. You go with innovation.
All right, so the idea that innovation only works under a capitalist country is just a false notion. And as you'll see in a couple of seconds, Crowder makes a claim that no innovation was made under communist regimes, as he calls them. And that's just obviously a false notion. The Soviet Union alone is a great example of where plenty of innovation came from. From art, there was new forms of art, especially before Stalin. There was great leaps in the medical field. So the first kidney transplant, heart transplant, lung transplant were all done in the Soviet Union by Soviet doctors. The discovery of stem cells was done by a Soviet scientist. The creation of underwater welding kits was done by Soviet engineers. Same thing with nuclear power plants. A majority of where our power in the United States comes from was a Soviet invention. So the idea that communist regimes, as he calls them, can't innovate is simply untrue. The final thing I'll say about this one is, has Steven Crowder heard of the space race? The Soviets were the first one to put a person in space. They were the first country to put a satellite in orbit. They were right behind us in landing on the moon. So I think the idea that, again, socialist countries can't innovate is just stupid.
Yeah, there's studies that prove that most of the innovation happens closest to the work, and of course it does. Of course, how is someone who's not actually working going to be able to innovate with the stuff he's working with, or that he's not working with? It doesn't even make any sense logically. And there's a famous story that they tell you if you major in business, where Steve Jobs got the first model of the iPhone, and he dropped it in a fish tank, and bubbles came up, and he goes, see, there's air inside the phone. You can make it smaller. And he gave it to the engineers, and they're like, okay, we'll make it smaller, Steve. And they tell you that story. Like, isn't Steve such an innovative businessman? It's like, he's not innovative, he's just oppressive. Those engineers are the ones with creativity and innovation. And as Engels said, all the advancement and progress that happens under capitalism happens by accident. Everything is done, all production is carried out in the pursuit of profit. Yes, there are technological advancements and innovations that come with that, but the ones that help the masses are by accident. Even in like the medical field, it's all profit-based, the pharmaceutical industry. You want to talk about risk?
Yeah, so when Steven Crowder mentions risk, I'm assuming that he's mentioning that this chair was built in a factory using somebody else's capital, and the factory was built with somebody else's capital. So he's saying that the capitalist is the one who took the financial risk, which I think risk is a really weird subject in capitalism. Like, yeah, even if somebody did put up financial risk, that's not the only risk that you can associate with working. So in this example, when he's talking about building the chair, there's a lot of risks that could be associated with the worker, the laborer. They could have a lot of running parts or saws. The potential to have physical harm is greatly increased for the laborer. Then you're also talking about mental risks. So just being a wage worker under capitalism brings with it a lot of stress. 78% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. That leads to great stress. You don't know where your your next meal is coming from, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that there's only financial risk to think of when we're talking about building this chair is silly, and it I like this quote: the only risk that a CEO or an owner faces is becoming a working class person. So if you lose all your money in a business, you have to become a worker again. That's really the risk.
You're just not taking into account the risk that the oil companies took when they lobbied the government to invade Iraq.
Oh, my bad. You're right.
Yes, that was very risky for them.
Part of the problem is that modern work is incredibly specialised. Specialised jobs make the modern economy highly efficient, but they also mean that it's seldom possible for any one worker to derive a sense of the genuine contribution they might be making to the real needs of humanity. Marx argued that modern work leads to alienation, Entfremdung. In other words, a feeling of disconnection between what you do all day and who you feel you really are and what you think you'd ideally be able to contribute to existence.
Here's the crux of Marxism. Karl Marx and people who forward this focus entirely on the worker, specifically the labor worker. Here's the thing, the labor worker is not a synonym for humanity. Humanity as a whole also needs medicine, progress and efficiency, agricultural innovation, needs for humanity that cannot be met if the mere labor worker's importance is placed above all else.
Marxists put the worker above all else. They don't think about agriculture and energy and all the things that are made and produced by workers. This is the dumbest argument I've ever heard in my life. Stephen, the whole idea is all those essential industries that make up society, which you just mentioned, need workers to function, yet they are not used to benefit the masses of society, the masses who work. The vast majority of people do not get a bunch of money from their dad to start a business selling right-wing talking points. The vast majority of society works to keep all these things like agriculture going. Yet these things are not used to benefit the masses of society. We produce more than enough food to feed every worker, yet 9 million people starve to death every year. This is the irrationality of the capitalist mode of production. And this is what Marxists are talking about. So you're so disconnected from the way things actually function, you're mentioning these industries that are run by productive workers and saying they have nothing to do with workers. It's hilarious.
I also love how Steven Crowder clutches his pearls here. He's like, oh, the horror of placing the labor worker over the whole of humanity, as if the majority of people don't work. Again, like Eddie said, it's not like we can all get a handout from our fathers to start a YouTube video or YouTube channel. Most people are working class people, so the idea that if you place the value of a worker over the value of humanity, that's almost like it doesn't make any sense. Like, that's the same thing. Most of humanity is workers.
Yeah, unless he's talking about service industry jobs, but even in those industries, even if they're not essential like agriculture, they're still making millions and millions and millions of dollars with their labor that is sucked up by people who have nothing to do with the production process. So,
modern work is insecure. Capitalism makes the human being utterly expendable, just one factor among others in the forces of production, and one that can ruthlessly be let go the minute that costs rise or savings can be made through technology.
Here's where the wordplay is so important from the unbelievably biased presenter. They've now referred to workers as utterly expendable under a capitalist system. No, in a free enterprise system, your value is determined precisely by your contributing power, your skill sets, and your work ethic. You're the best engineer in the world? You're paid your worth. Under communism, you're not. Your contribution is worth the exact same as the guy next to you on the factory line who has no interest in contributing at all.
I just stare at my desk, but it looks like I'm working.
Yeah, Eddie, under communism, did you know that everybody gets paid the same?
Dang it.
Also, I think it's hilarious that Steven Crowder used a clip from Office Space, which is supposed to show the mundanity of office work and the fact that people are so alienated from their jobs under capitalism that they will literally sit there and do nothing. he used that as a reason why communism is bad. I just... Does he not realize this before he put that in his video?
It's weird how it didn't cross his mind. Like you said, we were wondering if he's arguing in bad faith here or if he's just this dense. The fact that he would put Office Space as a critique of communism makes me think he's just that dense. And yeah, like a recent study showed that the average American spends 12.5 hours a week actually working, even though we spend like 40 hours a week at our actual job, because it's all about finding someone to sell your labor to, right? Because our system doesn't actually utilize human labor for the benefit of everyone. It's just about extracting as much labor as you can, which has now made it when there's not, there's more people than there is work to be done. People are just sitting and staring at their desks in capitalism, but I guess that's a critique of communism now.
I think after watching this a second time, I think Steven Crowder is just kind of an airhead. I remember the story of when he was going to debate Sam Cedar of the Majority Report, and Steven's manager, who's also his daddy, told him that he shouldn't debate Sam Cedar because he was going to get absolutely blown out. So Steven Crowder's just kind of a moron, and that's very evident in this analysis of the School of Life video where he clearly knows nothing about communism, and it's just very evident.
So while jobs may be legally barred from being deemed dispensable, guess what? Everything that makes you uniquely valuable as a human being is. It's entirely dispensable. You're a number.
I think this is just crazy. The fact that he thinks under communism you just become a number, while under capitalism there are people working dead-end jobs that they have no passion for. Under the newly formed USSR, you saw a growth of entertainment, from plays to theaters to music and even art. So there was a new form of socialist art that came out, or Soviet art that came about with the USSR. And it was really kind of crazy to see that once people weren't forced to work, they could actually express themselves creatively. They could show how they felt about their government, etc., until Stalin eventually put a stop to this. But, going and looking at some of these art pieces, they are really cool. And again, the idea that you aren't just a number under capitalism, you aren't expendable, is just not true.
It's that argument that all the criticisms of socialism and communism are just capitalist projection. Like you literally have a number in capitalism. You have a social security number that you get. I'm sure the army, the military has ways of labeling their soldiers. Your health insurance policy is a number. All these different bureaucracies that exist under capitalism label you with numbers. Like the idea that this is something that's unique to a socialist system is hilarious.
Yet, as Marx knew deep inside each of us, we don't want to be arbitrarily let go. We're terrified of being abandoned. Communism isn't just an economic theory. Understood emotionally, it expresses a deep-seated longing that we always have a place in the world's heart, that we will not be cast out.
Oh, see, that sounds nice, right? Place in the world's heart. But what he just expressed is exactly why communism lends itself to mass murdering authoritarian regimes so perfect. You will pay your bourgeois.
Come here, I kill you. You come here, where's my time?
Can't believe it. Communism can only prey on fear and insecurity. Can capitalism? Sure, but it can only work if it simultaneously highlights the human desire to succeed, to progress, and to grow. Communism can only even be attempted with a scared and broken people. Capitalism, free enterprise, is most effectively embraced by optimistic ones.
Communism can only be implemented when the people are scared and insecure. Well, why is that, Stephen? Why is it that people want to go from capitalism to communism? It's because capitalism makes people insecure. That's why you have so many people criticizing capitalism now, as we're facing a global pandemic. People can't pay their rent. People understand they have to find someone to sell their labor to, otherwise they're literally going to die. And that's why people look to create a new system, like socialism or communism. And you have a Fidel Castro in there as one of your mass murderers. Who was Fidel Castro overthrowing? Fulgencio Batista, who was a Western puppet whose country was run by slave plantations. So, yeah, that is a mass murdering and dictatorship there. Under the dominance of private capital, but you seem to have nothing to say about that, but a lot to say about Fidel. You got anything to add, Matt?
Yeah, I think that the idea that capitalism is, purely about human freedom is a false notion. And I think MLK says it best when he says, yeah, under capitalism you have freedom. You have freedom to hunger. You have freedom to be homeless. You have freedom to work for somebody for long hours and not own any of the value of your labor. And he also says, under capitalism there's this idea that if you have, if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you'll be all right. But he says it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps because capitalism has left so many people without boots.
Classic MLK.
Workers get paid little, while capitalists get rich. This is perhaps the most obvious qualm that Marx had with capitalism. In particular, he believed that capitalists shrink the wages of the labourers as much as possible in order to skim off a wide profit margin. He called this primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation. Whereas capitalists see profit as a reward for ingenuity and technological talent, Marx was far more damning. Profit is simply theft, and what you're stealing is the talent and hard work of your workforce.
So, Karl Marx thinks that profit is theft. You know what he doesn't think is theft? Actual theft.
I got robbed by a sweet old lady on a motorized cart. I didn't even see it coming.
Example, I invent the light bulb. I've toiled away, creating thousands of failed prototypes, investing some of the best years of my life while other people ate, slept, and enjoyed life.
Maybe we spent a little too much time puking off balconies. We had fun, huh?
Finally, I create a successful one, and it improves and saves billions of lives across the world. All because of an ingenious idea and work ethic. People across the world are willing to pay for my wonderful invention, and so I become wealthy. That's capitalism. According to Marxists, that's theft. Same situation. I invent the light bulb, only government comes in and takes all of my profit at gunpoint. According to Marxists, that's not theft. Are you getting it yet? That's what communism is, and yes, even socialism, which is why all of the Bernie supporters can be found under this video liking it like it's hot. At the end of the day, it comes down to men with guns forcing you to give them your stuff.
Yes, communism is when the government comes and it takes all the profit from capitalists with guns. And Steven Crowder is astute enough to know that this is not just communism, but this is also socialism. The Bernie Sanders supporters will tell you that it's only communism when the government comes and takes your profit with guns. But Steven Crowder's here to tell you that socialism and communism are when the government comes and takes your profit with guns.
Yeah, I take back what I said about Steven Crowder not understanding Marxist theory. Obviously, that clip right there showed that he does. Obviously, we're kidding. And I think that the idea that you should be rewarded for creating an invention such as the light bulb, I think you should be compensated. You know, your labor did go into creating that. But the idea that you deserve all of the profit after you are most likely not going to be building all of these light bulbs yourself. You're going to hire workers to do this. And the fact that you should take all of their surplus value that they add, taking your invention and then creating it for all people is just kind of silly. The other thing is going back to being rewarded for something that you created with your labor. I like the example of the inventor of insulin. So Frederick Banting sold a patent for insulin for $1, saying that insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world. So even though he spent all this time creating insulin, he realized that ultimately this would be for the greater good, so I don't deserve the intellectual property rights to it. And he sold his patent. Well, the government of Canada was still like, you created this for the whole world. You didn't want any rewards. We're still going to reward you. We're going to make sure that you get rewarded for all of the labor that you put in to developing this, all of the creativity, and ultimately just the fact that he gave up his intellectual property for the greater good is very admirable.
Yeah, and people act like labor can't be carried out for the good of the whole. Like, it has to be carried out at a profit or it's not going to happen. Like, NASA exists. Look at NASA and the kind of work that they're doing compared to SpaceX. SpaceX is working on tourism in space and building Minecraft cars and doing coups in Bolivia, whereas NASA is working on things for human innovation and human discovery that furthers the good of the masses. You're telling me NASA wouldn't have invented light bulbs? You needed the free market for someone to invent something that illuminates dark spaces? No, that's something that scientists came up with by laboring, and they could easily have done that working for NASA rather than for, or Thomas Edison could have done it even if he wasn't a capitalist, and we know he was kind of a turd.
What's that? What's that thing you're working on?
Well, it's a light bulb and...
A light bulb! Light bulb! Yeah, I invented that. Me! I'm Thomas Edison. I invented the light bulb. What's it do?
It lights up a room using electrical...
Lights up a room using electrical stuff. I was about to say that because I invented it. What are you working on?
It's a phonograph.
Phonograph! I knew that because I invented it. I'm Thomas Edison. I rule!
Look it up. Edison was a dick.
So you wonder why not only communism lends itself to authoritarian regimes, but why leftism lends itself to more violent, disruptive protests like Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street. It's because despite what hippies and democratic socialists tell you, at its core, communism and socialism, through its only available methods of collection and distribution, are predicated on the use of violent force.
So communism and socialism are inherently authoritarian, as is all leftism, and this is what the BLM protests are. Yet, what are the BLM protests, Stephen? They are protests against authoritarianism. The cops in the capitalist USA shooting people in the streets for no reason are what sparked the BLM protest. But according to him, no, BLM is an authoritarian group, I guess, and communism is authoritarian, not capitalism.
Yeah, this also doesn't account for the fact that most of the Black Lives Matter protests this summer were peaceful. And
the vast majority.
The vast majority, I think over 90%. And also, this again connects back to what MLK was saying. MLK was an advocate for nonviolence, but he recognized that if people have a boot on their throat for such a long time, they're eventually going to act out in riotous ways, which is why he said that the riot is the voice of the unheard.
Yes, these are responses to authoritarianism because police are a tool for upholding private capital.
True capitalism and free enterprise require voluntary transactions. Communism and socialism require coercion. You will piss off, cut out Karl Marx.
Yes, capitalism doesn't involve coercion because you have the choice to die instead of work. We learned this from our genius libertarian friends who informed us that if we don't like capitalism, we should just stop working and die. So that is a voluntary and free exchange, which couldn't exist under communism.
But non-aggression principle, Eddie.
Yes, the non-aggression principle.
NAP.
I forgot. And the capitalist state is non-violent as well, right?
Right. They
definitely don't stop hungry people from getting food that's going to be thrown out anyways.
Actually, Eddie, last week in Oregon, Fred Meyer store threw out thousands of pounds of food due to a power outage. And instead of letting people dig through the dumpster to take food out if they're hungry, the police were called to protect the dumpster from people who are trying to dumpster dive for food. It's so weird how the police are used as a tool of capital to protect the interests of capital. Stores would rather have their food go bad than have people come and take it out and eat it if they're hungry.
Well, that's communism.
Crises are endemic to capitalism, and they're caused by something rather odd. The fact that we're able to produce too much, far more than anyone needs to consume. Capitalist crises are crises of abundance, rather than, as in the past, crises of shortage.
Interesting that Karl Marx brought up shortages in the past, because after people followed his philosophy, these governments created the greatest shortages the modern world had ever seen in communist countries. But that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Sometimes American journalists talk about how bad a country is because people are lining up for food. That's a good thing.
That just really pisses me off hearing about how America doesn't have bread lines because we're capitalist, when over the summer and even now we're seeing bread lines exist because the capitalist mode of production is not allowing for goods to be distributed in such a way that people have their basic needs. So I remember in Texas over Thanksgiving break, they had 25,000 people line up for a Thanksgiving meal because they were hungry, because they didn't have work. because our government just botched the coronavirus pandemic, but then our capitalist mode of production didn't allow any way for it to catch up or anything like that. Also, in Iowa, where we live, it's just, I think there were tens of thousands of people lining up for food in October. Same thing in California. All these places where we had actual bread lines. But yeah, Steven Crowder, keep talking about how bread lines only exist in socialism.
Yes, and we have an abundance of food, yet we have people lining up, having to beg for it and get it from charity because the system of distribution is irrational. And they have Bernie there saying it's a good thing that people were lining up for food. I'm not familiar with that clip, but I'm assuming what he's saying is it's good that people are lining up for food in socialist countries instead of starving to death. That people can now line up and be delivered food that's being rationed by the government rather than previously when they were being allowed to starve. And as that Howard Waitskin study shows, and every socialist experiment has shown since that study was conducted, all these countries were radically reduced poverty and hunger. And people were now getting food because the food was being rationed, because a lot of these places also face economic warfare from the United States, or they were an impoverished feudal country, and they had to build their productive forces, and they had to ration food for a while. But Bernie is likely saying it's a good thing that they were getting any food at all, rather than starving, which they were doing under capitalism.
You go, you democratic socialists, you. I like this guy. Now, what he has said here is true. It is absolutely true. Most problems in a capitalist society are caused by that of overabundance. For example, we have an obesity problem here in the United States. We have such unfettered access to the widest variety of food the world has ever seen that, yeah, some people can choose to be fat. And it's an annoying problem in the United States. It results in broken scales, tight airplane seat squeezes, and Lena Dunham. In communist Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea, they have bread lines. Take your pick.
It's crazy how in a country of 330 million people that there will be both people who are obese and also millions of malnourished people. So in our country right now, we have 41 million malnourished people, including millions of children. This is both due to, again, a lack of equitable food distribution and also the presence of food deserts in a lot of low-income areas. So food deserts are basically where there's a lack of healthy food options. So in low-income areas, that's a lot of the times there's only fast food restaurants. So people have the option to only eat fast food. The other thing is there's not a marketable demand for a store with healthy food options in food deserts, but that doesn't mean that people don't want them there. Just because it's not a marketable demand doesn't mean that there isn't demand for it at all. It just means that people don't have enough money to purchase or support a grocery store there. But I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to, expand some capital, put some money into a grocery store, maybe supported by the government, to both employ people but also give people in food deserts healthy food options.
Yeah, a lot of the obesity crisis is actually tied to food deserts, which is interesting enough, but it makes sense if you think about it, because food production under capitalism is carried out to make a profit. Just look at McDonald's, and that food that they're selling you is not necessarily going to be healthy, but you have people who are working 40 to 60 hours a week, coming home from work tired, and they don't want to cook, which is why it was showed that in the Soviet Union they had a better diet than we have in the U.S. They were getting healthier meals, but the same amount of calories after they increased their productive forces to the point where they could distribute what was created by their agriculture. And even in Venezuela, with 160 some U.S. sanctions on them, Iran and Venezuela are teaming up to do government-funded grocery stores that keep the prices of the food really cheap to combat starvation, which is caused by the sanctions that are coming from the capitalist country.
None shall interfere. Do as you please.
Our factories and systems are so efficient, we could give everyone on this planet a car, a house, access to a decent school and a hospital. And that's what so enraged Marx, but also made him so hopeful too. Few of us actually need to work because the modern economy is so productive.
And how did those factories and hospitals become so efficient? See, giving away all of this stuff, as Karl Marx wants to do through communism or socialism, requires that it be done on the back of capitalism. Again, this channel wants you to believe that it's presenting its information as factual and not propaganda, which is important because this isn't a factual argument, but a moral one.
Yeah, so I made this argument in my original School of Life video, but that is the whole point of Marxism, to look at capitalism and how it's been extremely productive. It's created these things like medicine, food, and housing, yet it doesn't distribute it to people, right? Because of the market system. There's more empty houses than there are homeless people, and that's all because landlords have to make a profit, so they're not just going to let people move into those houses, even though it's normal, moral, ethical, common sense, which is what Marx observed, you know, and like we said, the average worker at this point is doing 12.5 hours of work, actual work, a week. So humans are just selling their labor for no reason and are spending way too much time at work, more than they need. And capitalism has been insanely productive. And if we were to have the working class, the ones who have created all these things, medicine, advancements, and everything, if we were to have them mandate how production is carried out rather than a small minority of people who haven't produced any of the things that you see around you, we could do things a lot better in a way that makes a lot more sense and is way less irrational. Anything to add?
No, I think you hit on that pretty well.
Sweet. Historical and dialectical materialism. Google it, folks.
But rather than seeing this need not to work as the freedom it is, we complain about it masochistically and describe it by a pejorative word, unemployment. We should call it freedom. There's so much unemployment for a good and deeply admirable reason, because we're so good at making things efficiently. We're not all needed at the coalface. But in that case, we should, thought Marx, make leisure admirable. We should redistribute the wealth of the massive corporations that make so much surplus money and give it to everyone. This is, in its own way, as beautiful a dream as Jesus' promise of heaven, but a good deal more realistic sounding.
If you believe it's the government's job to encourage unemployment and leisure in place of productivity and innovation...
Well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
By the way, while we're comparing leisure, which vacation would you rather take? Silly communists. I guess it depends. The most leisurely activity Russians ever engaged in was defecting.
I defect. You about ready to get maced?
Oh my God, don't you get it? He's defecting!
So the School of Life video is making kind of a wrong argument here, so Steven Crowder is engaging with a straw man. But Marx's whole point wasn't to make everyone unemployed so they could leisure all day. It was to utilize productivity so that it would work for the benefit of the masses rather than for the enrichment of a few capitalists. And let's talk about the freedom and leisure that we have under capitalism that Steven Crowder seems to think is so abundant.
Yeah, Stephen thinks that capitalism is the only system in which you'll be truly free, but then he also makes fun of people who want to leisure, as he calls it. And I think that's crazy. In the video, he's shown that we're creating an overabundance of products, showing that we don't need to work as much as we do, and yet he's talking down upon that. And then 2 seconds later, he shows a clip about what he thinks a communist vacation would be, which would be working. And so after hearing that, under communism, people want, more leisure time. The idea that people would be slaving away on their vacation when, Soviets had 2 weeks of vacation time.
And what essentially amounted to a timeshare as well. They were given to vacation later on in the Soviet Union.
And the fact that America is one of 2 countries in the entire world to not have paid time or paid family leave. Under capitalism, we literally have almost no freedom. People are working 52 weeks out of the year.
Right. It's the ultimate freedom for a very small minority. You're just saying, I want a very small minority of people who inherited tons of wealth to be able to do whatever they want, and the masses of society should just have to work for them. And, not to, be ultra tanky here, but even in, the DPRK in North Korea, they have water parks. You can look this up. It's not like every communist country is just a bunch of people working on an assembly line. As we keep saying, that's just projection. That's what capitalism is like.
Capitalism is bad for capitalists. Marx didn't think that capitalists were evil. For example, he was acutely aware of the sorrows and secret agonies that lay behind bourgeois marriage. Marx argued that marriage was actually an extension of business, and that the bourgeois family was fraught with tension, oppression, and resentment, with people staying together not for love, but for financial reasons. Marx believed that the capitalist system forces everyone to put economic interests at the heart of their lives, so that they can no longer know deep, honest relationships. He called this psychological tendency commodity fetishism, Warenfetischismus, because it makes us value things that have no objective value. He wanted people to be freed from financial constraint so that they could, at last, start to make sensible, healthy choices in their relationships.
See, this is interesting because a lot of people don't realize just how anti-marriage and traditional family Karl Marx was. Granted, yes, marriage is one of the greatest indicators we have of economic stability, wealth, and growth. It's also the biggest indicator we have available for health, longevity, and personal happiness. Here's where contrast is so important. Whereas Karl Marx sought to destroy the traditional family, the founding fathers in the United States were emphatic about it being the central building block to the American way of life. Why? Because before a municipal, state, or federal government, you had a moral level of self-governance within the family. One that led to a happier and, as Karl Marx has pointed out, more financially productive society. And that's why many of our marriage laws exist in the books to begin with.
So Steven Crowder hears the argument that people only stay in marriage because of the financial and economic reasons, and then goes on to make the argument that, yes, people who are married are better off economically. Like, yes, that's literally the point. People who are together are better off economically, but they might be trapped in a loveless marriage. They might be there out of necessity rather than, freedom. And Kristen Godsey, in her book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, talks about how women make more meaningful connections under socialism because instead of looking for a man that they want to settle with for the economic dependency of it, women have more financial freedoms, so they can actually get with somebody or be with somebody that they want to out of love, have deeper, meaningful relationships rather than relying on somebody specifically for the financial necessity of it.
Yes, and what Steven Crowder is talking about here, as far as Marx and Engels thought very clunkily and wrong, is what Engels observes by studying anthropology in Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And that is that as the state and private property emerge, the family emerges alongside it. So in original communal societies, you have a form of communal marriage. There was no paired marriage, or what we call the communal family. And things worked by maternal law. So you would know a son or a daughter belonged to a mom because the mom gave birth to them, but you didn't necessarily know who the dad was because they had this form of communal marriage. Once you have private property and men start to use the state to accumulate all these goods and all this wealth, and they develop the concept of ownership, they want to develop paternal law, what's known as the patriarchy, where they can pass all their wealth down generationally to their kids. And that is when you start to see the nuclear family get formed. It develops alongside of private property, as he says, and as the founding fathers noticed, as an economic necessity, so that women can do all the domestic work for free while the man goes and labors and makes tons of money for a capitalist all day. The capitalist system is dependent on a nuclear family, and like we said, this leaves people in a situation where a lot of them have to stay with abusive husbands and whatnot out of economic necessity. People don't have freedom in their love lives because the nuclear family, or capitalism, is so dependent on this nuclear family.
The 20th century feminist answer to the oppression of women has been to argue that women should simply be able to go out to work. But Marx's answer was more subtle. This feminist insistence merely perpetuates human slavery. The point isn't that women should imitate the sufferings of their male colleagues. It's that men and women should have the permanent option to enjoy leisure.
And this is why modern social justice warriors like feminists are so far to the left. Is there anything more appealing to troglodytes like Trigglypuff than not getting married, which wasn't going to happen anyway, claiming that you're a strong woman while not working? Karl Marx was creating his fan base early.
Now I know nothing about that girl in the video. I don't know anything about her politics. But the idea that SJWs and most feminists as a whole are so far to the left, the idea that they're all a bunch of communists, is just laughable to me. I know a lot of what you'd consider SJWs who are very much in the center. They back the Democratic Party line because their only focus is on identity politics rather than on economic politics.
Yes, and that's kind of been the right's thing, to call out these people, especially back when that video came out. They called that girl Trigglypuff, and Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, Steven Crowder were obsessed with that girl, and she just became the face of the left. Like, this is what communism is, liberalism, all of it. If Steven Crowder thinks you're on the left, you are the same as this girl screaming. I think she was protesting like a Ben Shapiro speaking engagement or something.
In short, one of the biggest evils of capitalism is not that there are corrupt people at the top. This is true in any human hierarchy. But that capitalist ideas teach all of us to be anxious, competitive, conformist, and politically complacent.
This is key. We'll get to the philosophy in a second, but I love how he skimmed over. Corruption at the top is seen in any hierarchy. It's a valid point, and one that unravels Karl Marx's central argument. Sure, in capitalism or free enterprise, there are no doubt some corrupt people at the top. In a true free enterprise system, that corruption is mitigated by the concept of competition.
He really said, in a system of free enterprise and competition, you won't have monopolies. And then he brought up 2 of the 7 sister oil companies, Shell and British Petroleum.
Now, invariably, when that corruption does occur, repeatedly and systematically, as you see with big banks, big energy, big unions, they can only do so when abetted by big government. Big banks are able to continually be corrupt. Why? Not because of capitalism, but because of a never-ending supply of big bailout funds from equally corrupt politicians.
Yeah, that part's kind of true, that these banks are able to stay in power because of donations from the government, which is something Karl Marx observed, and he said the state under capitalism becomes corrupted and functions as a tool of private capital. So every time these crises hit, which are inevitable to capitalism, here comes the Federal Reserve to print out a bunch of money for the capitalist class. And the state is also used as a tool to crush unions, which you hear him say big unions, comparing them to big finance capital. It's like unions are actively fighting against the company. Unions are in opposition to finance capital. He just lumps them all together there, like BP, Chase Bank, and unions. They're all the same thing.
The only union that I can think of that is actually legitimately corrupt is, police unions. These unions who are there to protect the interest of private capital via protecting and keeping on the force these corrupt officers, these horrible officers, who are, again, used by the state to put down labor movements, to, again, like we mentioned earlier, protect dumpsters from dumpster divers. It's just crazy that, the corrupt unions, and he was talking about the teachers union, I'm sure, which, that does have some problems. But I'd rather have a union that keeps some unwilling members employed than not, when it comes to actual workers, not when it comes to the police.
I'm a big fan of my dad's union teacher healthcare that has allowed me to not die if I need to go see a doctor.
Now, at least you can still choose to use a local bank or credit union who never required bailouts to begin with. But let's change the scenario. The big corrupt government you and I both hate for bailing out big banks, now it is the bank. It is your only bank. It is also your only grocery store, your only phone provider, your only health insurance. That's communism.
Now, Matt, think about this. Do you really want the government to take away your choice of health insurance?
Oh, you mean the one where I spend thousands of dollars and only get some things, or thousands of dollars and only get some things covered?
No, you see, under the government healthcare, the government would be healthcare, and your doctor would be the government, and you would actually pay all of your money, and if you tried to save any of it, the government would come with a gun, and they would take your money.
Oh, I get it now. You know what? I don't really want my money going to help other people's surgeries.
Yes.
That's why I like private insurance.
Yes, and I also have a deep loyalty to Chase Bank. I really, when he said that struck a chord with me. I was like, what? There's going to be no Chase Bank for me to go put my money in? No! This is the communist hell that our teachers have been warning us about since kindergarten.
As seen with every communist regime ever, it leads to massive death and totalitarianism every time. So if this man and Karl Marx acknowledge that in any hierarchy you will find corruption at the top, why, oh why, would you want to hand over that top to a centralized government monopoly where no voluntary transactions are even necessary, only the use of violent coercion.
No, Stephen, we're saying that's what capitalism is, and we want to take it and give it to the people at the bottom.
Yeah, a violent centralized power that has a monopoly on violence, like the state, which is being used by capital to suppress labor movements, to put down workers.
Not to mention their actions abroad, what the U.S. State Department does at the behest of finance capitalists abroad. And we want to take that finance capital, the city banks that Steven Crowder is getting a boner for, and give it to the workers, the people who actually work, and the people who have no incentive to bomb others overseas, unless we want to get into a conversation about the labor aristocracy. But you know what? I don't know that Steven Crowder's actually read Marx. I'm starting to think that. I don't know about you.
No, after watching the video a second time through, I think your analysis is quite astute there.
Yes.
Marx was not a well-regarded or popular intellectual in his day.
No, I can't imagine he was. He's not a respected intellectual today outside of your pot-smoking drum circle at college.
Yes, communism has no effect in the world, and nobody believes communism. Ignore the 90 million communist members of China, the second largest superpower in the world, or the millions of Marxist intellectuals who are out there. We kind of debunked that in the beginning.
Respectable, conventional people of Marx's day would have laughed at the idea that his ideas could remake the world. Yet, just a few decades later, they did. His writings became the keystone for some of the most important ideological movements of the 20th century. But Marx was like a brilliant doctor in the early days of medicine. He could recognize the nature of the disease, although he had no idea how to go about curing it.
Yes, Karl Marx was central to some of the biggest ideological revolutions of this century. Here they are.
Yes, that one was very good. Oh, I like that one too. Wait, rewind. I thought I saw myself for a second.
Steven Crowder shows Tiananmen Square as if that didn't happen after China opened itself up to Western markets.
Yeah, that was under Deng.
Yeah.
The market reforms. And yeah, I mean, you could just say, like, mass murders happen under everyone. Like, he showed Fidel Castro there. We made this argument earlier, but look at what Cuba was under Batista. Or look at any of the countries where the U.S. is dropping bombs and destabilizing right now. What a joke of an argument. What a joke of a man.
At this point in history, we should all be Marxists, in the sense of agreeing with his diagnosis of our troubles. But we need to go out and find the cures that really will work.
And this is how it ends. We should all be Marxists, demanding conformity in place of intellectual diversity and telling us exactly how to think. Well, how Marxist of you.
Steven Crowder makes fun of the line, we should all be Marxists, and says, oh, that's ideological conformity. But he didn't listen to the very next sentence, which was, we should all be Marxists in the sense that we should critique capitalism, find the flaws in it, and then we can decide how to move forward in addressing the system.
Yeah, and what's so messed up about the part about communism and ideological conformity, Michael Parenti is one of the most genius Marxist historians of all time, and he was blackballed from academia. Cornel West was fired from Harvard by Larry Summers, who was something like the Secretary of Treasury and also the president of Harvard, who coincidentally fired the only Marxist professor. There's an ideological conformity in the United States that produces loudmouths like Steven Crowder and censors geniuses like Cornel West. So yeah, anything to add here, Matt?
Yeah, also the idea of ideological conformity when there's very few Marxist economics places all around the country in universities. When most of our economics taught in college right now is very much Western, somewhat Austrian economics, I think that's really weird that we're talking about ideological conformity.
Yeah, read Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine and Jane Mayer's Dark Money. Dark Money's about how the U.S. economic system has had money dumped into it to force all our college programs to be Milton Friedmanites or Hayek Mises followers. And then Shock Doctrine is about how the U.S. overthrows governments overseas and then gives them Chicago School Friedmanite economists to run their economy. So capitalism is enforced and implemented by authoritarianism from the state, and ideological conformity is also enforced by both private entities and the state. So anything you want to add before we wrap it up here, Matt?
No, I think that was fun. I really like going through that, and just shitting on Steven Crowder. I had a good time.
Yes, he's a hilarious guy, and it was fun to break this one down with a friend. I think if I was alone, I might have punched through my computer. I appreciate that. Follow Matt on TikTok at Matt Connolly.
Matt M. Connolly.
Matt M. Connolly. There you go.
There you go.
He will be the next president, and you'll be seeing more of him on the channel, hopefully. All right. Peace, everyone.
Deuces.